You get public money, let the public in.
I want to take that alone.
Public money, let the public in.
Two more doors this way.
Public in.
Public money, let the public in.
Public money, let the public in. You get public money, let the public in. You get public money, let the public in.
They will. Schools, not banks. 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 So, if everybody thinks back 2 to 3 years ago, there was no question who was responsible for the economic crisis, who was responsible for the financial meltdowns. And everyone knew that it was Wall Street and the big banks. We all knew that it wasn't public workers. That's right. And that it wasn't people who are receiving Medicaid and are receiving benefits that they need to survive. It wasn't students in inner city schools. It wasn't because of something they're calling unfunded pension liabilities of public pensions. We all know who was responsible. And at that time, back at the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009, these bankers were acting contrite. They were saying, oh, you know, we are very sorry and we didn't realize that our models were going to fail the way they were. But what's happened since then? Somehow they've managed to do a reversal. They flipped out of the hold and now they say, it's your fault. It's your fault, poor people. It's your fault, working people. Particularly you overpaid public unionists. And especially you teachers. We've been battering you for 30 years. And why do you think we've been doing that? We've been doing that to set up this situation. Now, how much money were they given in the bailout? They were given $4.7 trillion in loans, not $800 billion from TARP alone. They were given more than 5 times that, mainly from the Federal Reserve, doing that without even congressional approval. Ben Bernanke just printed up money for them. And they were given another more than $9 trillion in loan guarantees, so they can continue to have money shoveled in the back door by the Fed and shovel it in out the front door to us at usurious interest rates. So they've made a fortune, and they still have not repaid $2 trillion of it, or $1.93 trillion to be more precise. How much is $2 trillion? Well, if you were to take all the state deficits of the 50 states, and all the municipal deficits, and all of the so-called unfunded pension liabilities, and add them together, you would get about $2 trillion. So we know where the money's gone. The money's gone to them. The money's gone to them. They've taken the private debt and they've morphed it into public debt. And they're now trying to make it into common sense that it's our fault, not theirs. Now, we know where the blame is, and just under the surface, everyone knows. You don't have to scratch very deep to know that it's the banks. It's Wells Fargo, Bank of America. It's J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and the big Wall Street firms that have the money. And it's time for them to pay up. They need to repay the entire $2 trillion, plus the more than $1 trillion that they ripped off on the interest and loans and so on. And that will end the crisis, and it will fund schools, and we won't have to go back even to the status quo the way it was, because we know that was unacceptable. So they need to pay up. Now what's happened in Oakland? In Oakland, the bankers and corporations installed a state takeover put in by Eli Broad, the Los Angeles billionaire who thinks he's running education in the country. Broad was called in by Jerry Brown and by Jack O'Connell. Brown was the mayor of Oakland, O'Connell was the state superintendent of instruction, and they asked Eli Broad in 2003 to name the first state administrator. He named Randy Ward, and he named all kinds of people who worked for Randy Ward, some of whom continue to work in the Oakland Unified School District Administration today. Now, he also then, the next 2 state administrators, Kim Statham and Vince Matthews, were also trained in the Broad Institute's Urban Superintendent's Academy. What did they do? They closed libraries in nearly every middle school and in many high schools, including Castlemont, where I taught throughout that entire period. They laid off custodians, food service workers. They privatized. They outsourced so that Oakland has nearly double
the outsourcing of contracts of the average California school district. And that's why, although they supposedly came in to clear a $37 million debt, instead they tripled it to $110 million.
What did they
Do with the triple debt? Why? They gave it to the banks to sell off. Securitize it, and said sell it as bonds. The collateral on the bonds are Oakland public schools, Oakland High and other public schools collateral. This is what's known as a collateralized debt obligation. Does this sound familiar? They did to us what they did in the home loan bubble. They took our money, they securitized it, they chopped it up, and then they sold it off, and the banks sold it off. Now, Wells Fargo and the other big banks have an obligation and responsibility to us. They need to cough up the money that they have stolen in the greatest ripoff in history. That $2 trillion needs to come back. And I want to say one other thing. This was not by accident. Here's a fact none of you may know, but I worked as a program analyst for Wells Fargo Bank 30 years ago for 9 months. And I worked there at the time that they were deregulating telephone. And they circulated through the bank to every employee a memo saying, telephone's been deregulated, what can banking learn from that? What can we learn about how to exploit the free market? We saw what they learned about how to exploit the free market. That is, how can they rip us off, put the burden on our back, and then when the whole Ponzi schemes collapse, figure out how to shift it over and blame it on us. It's time to end this. Bail out schools, not banks.